Hello. So today we're going to make our code pop up our inventory automatically and populate it with our inventory items automatically. This is an important episode. You really need to understand exactly how this stuff works, but once you do, you're going to have a really easy time of it. It's a very simple set of basic mechanical pieces. With that in mind, let's go ahead and start. In order to display our inventory, we're going to need an inventory. So our inventory's primary purpose is to tell us what is in it. The inventory is just a container of things. So why don't we go ahead and add in the generics namespace. This will give us access to the list. Lists are better than arrays for this sort of thing because you can modify them really easily. So this is our list of stuff. Let's go ahead and add in a new object. We'll call this the hero. And each hero could have their own, yes please, add it in the middle of nowhere. Each hero could have their own inventory using this approach. But it's empty. Let's go ahead and use this trick here where we press this lock button, and then we can cruise on over to the inventory subdirectory, grab all this stuff, and drop it in. Don't forget to unlock it or he'll be confused. So now we have a list of 5 things in our inventory. How do we get from having this list to showing the player this list? Well, we need to display it. Now hopefully you're starting to see the trend. This approach relies on the display code and the data code being unrelated. And this is a really powerful approach for any size team, whether you're 1 person or 100 people. If your display item and your inventory core data items are separate, that means that your level designers and gameplay balance people can do a lot of editing on their side, and your visual people can do a lot of editing on their side, and there's never going to be a clash. Well, you'll always get a clash because someone will always screw something up, but the clashes will be minor. If it's just you, you're going to be able to remember how things work a whole lot better if you're not constantly wading through display code when you're trying to edit statuses and statuses when you're trying to edit display code. It's just easier all around to use this simple approach where your data is in one set of classes and your displays are handled by a separate set of classes. Now, what does the inventory display have to understand? Well, first off, it has to understand where it's going to be putting this stuff. Because we need to target that vertical list. Remember that column that we created? So that column probably isn't our inventory display, isn't the same thing that our inventory display is attached to. So we need to specify it right here, and I'll show you that in a second. We're also going to need to have a inventory item display prefab. So obviously what we're going to do is create a lot of these and put them in this. So if we were to take our canvas here, now you can do this with one of the sub-objects, but then you're going to have to manually add it to a canvas. So we'll go ahead and just use the canvas. There we go. So now we have a functioning canvas here where we are able to display our inventory to this location. And it'll pop up on the screen automatically and all that jazz, but it's really not supposed to exist. You're not going to have an inventory floating on the screen all the time. So how do we create it? Well, we're going to need our inventory, or our hero, or whatever we want to call it. We're going to need it to have the ability to call that into existence. Pretty straightforward, right? So if we go to our hero, you can see that there is now a slot for that, and we can drop that in. So now everything is referencing everything else. Our hero has an inventory display, and our inventory display can find its inventory item display, and we are ready to wire all of this stuff together. One thing I do want to keep clear: because of this approach, each hero can have their own inventory display prefab. This is a pretty good approach because it will allow your artists or yourself to create different visuals for everyone's inventory. So your warrior might have an inventory made out of steel plate or whatever, and your magician might have an inventory made out of sparkles. It also allows you to override that with mod information if you need to. So you could have a modded inventory item display or inventory display which you could drop in and it would do something different. Flexibility is good in this case. So this is preferable to having a global that just keeps track of the inventory display prefab, because the global would only be able to use one and it would be a little bit fragile. Unfortunately, this does mean you'll have to keep track of it, and if you change the prefab to a different prefab, you might have to drag and drop, but it's up to you. I think it's a better approach. Anyway, we still have to wire it up. How do we wire this up? Well, the first step is we're going to go ahead and just have the inventory call it into existence. Now, in an actual finished game, you'd have like a button or something that does this. We're just going to make it happen automatically for the sake of our sanity. Now, this should be something you already understand. It's just instancing an object. Very, very basic stuff. We have to tell it that it's an inventory display object because instantiate returns a generic object and C# doesn't automatically cast it. But this is a very basic thing. We've got an inventory display and now we're instantiating it. And now all we have to do is prime it. Prime? What do you mean there's no prime? How do we tell the inventory what we would like it to draw? Well, I've gone ahead and filled it in. We are going to pass it a list of items. Oh, we need to add in the generic namespace. So now our inventory display takes in a list of items. These are data items. These are things like sword, helmet. What we need to do is turn them into displays, things that show a picture of a sword. Well, we actually have a pretty easy time of that. Inventory item display equals inventory item display instantiate item display prefab. So we've just created a visual for it. Each item will now have a visual that gets created in the game world, but these visuals are not in the right place and they're not primed. Display dot transform dot set parent to target transform. And I generally always specify whether or not I want the world transform to stay. In this case, we definitely don't. So now it's in the right spot, and it'll pop up, but it'll just say button, or whatever the default is. It won't actually say sword. So we're going to have to deprime it. Prime item. So this is a pretty basic setup. Just to make it real clear what's happening, the inventory primes the inventory display, and the inventory display primes each individual item. So this is a very basic way to set it up so that it just spools out all of the items we're going to need. Now if we go back out here and we hit play, there it is, like magic. So the hero's items are all now on the screen, and this inventory is popped up out of nothing. It didn't exist in the scene. We created it using code, and that's really critical. We're going to be doing a lot of stuff in code, and you really have to understand the core concepts here. So the data is being passed from the hero to the inventory display, and then the inventory display is taking that data and spooling it out to individual item displays. And we get this nice effect where the hierarchy is all automatic. We don't have to worry too much about anything. That's really critical because down the line we're going to be adding in some highly functional code, and we're not going to want to mess it up. The simpler your path is, the simpler everything is, the more you can extend it. because there's human brains can only hold so much, and especially if you're in a one-person team, the more complex your game gets, the more critical it is to make it so that the code is really easy to use and easy to modify. Anyhow, I hope you've understood these core concepts, and I'm going to go over them once more just to make absolutely sure, because this is something you really need to understand. We have an inventory with a list of items. These are all data items like dagger, sword, beef, whatever. We also have the display object we're going to use, so we can instantiate that display object and pass it this list. The display object has all of the things it needs to create each individual item and take it from being a data item to being a display item, and that is how it works. You just spool it out. If you have any questions, please ask. If you are not solid on this foundation, everything else is going to be too complicated because you're not going to have a foundation to build on. But we're going to start to talk about how to make these lists interactive and how to hook them into your code in the least painful way possible. And that is going to require that you understand what I just did. So please, if you didn't, ask.